Prologue, Normandy, 1944. The rifle that wasn't meant for front. Normandy did not look like the maps. It did not resemble the clean arrows drawn in briefing rooms in southern England. It did not unfold in neat formations advancing inland behind armored columns. The first hours after the landings dissolved into fragments, isolated squads, scattered officers, lost paratroopers, engineers carrying demolition charges through hedgerows, radio operators searching for signal through terrain that swallowed transmission. War, in those moments, was not organized. It was improvised, along narrow dirt lanes bordered by thick Norman hedges. Soldiers moved in small groups. Many of them were not riflemen in the formal sense. They were medics, signal corps technicians, forward artillery observers, truck drivers separated from their convoys, officers cut off from their companies, tank crewmen forced to dismount when vehicles were disabled, and many of them carried the same weapon. Not the M1 Garand, not the Browning automatic rifle, not a Thompson submachine gun. They carried a compact wooden stock weapon with a short barrel and a 15-round detachable magazine, lighter than a service rifle, easier to carry than a submachine gun, more controllable than a pistol. The M1 Carbine. It was not designed for this. The carbine was never intended to equip assault infantry storming fortified coastlines. It was not meant to replace the Garand. It was not conceived as a frontline battle rifle. When the U.S. Army requested its development in 1940, the purpose was administrative and practical, not revolutionary. The Army needed something for soldiers who were expected to defend themselves, but not to fight sustained infantry engagements. The carbine was meant for second-line troops. Yet in Normandy, in June 1944, the distinction between front-line and second-line collapsed within hours of the landings. Engineers clearing obstacles found themselves under rifle fire. Radio operators were ambushed while establishing command posts. Truck drivers encountered German patrols on narrow roads. Paratroopers landed miles from their objectives and had to fight in small, ad hoc groups. In these fragmented battles, the sidearm was insufficient. A pistol offered limited range, limited accuracy, and limited magazine capacity. A full-size rifle, while powerful, was heavy and long, difficult to maneuver through hedgerows, buildings, and dense terrain. The carbine occupied the space between. It weighed just over 5 pounds unloaded, nearly 4 pounds lighter than the M1 Garand. It was short enough to handle inside vehicles, trenches, and farmhouses. Its detachable magazine allowed rapid reloads. Its recoil was mild. Its manual of arms was simple. Soldiers with minimal training could operate it effectively. What had been designed as a defensive weapon for rear-echelon personnel became, in practice, a force multiplier in chaotic frontline conditions. The carbine did not replace the Garand. It supplemented it, and that distinction would matter, because by the end of the war, more than 6 million M1 carbines would be produced, more than any other American small arm of World War II. It would arm officers, paratroopers, radio men, heavy weapon crews, military police tankers, and support units across Europe and the Pacific. It would appear in photographs from Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, Okinawa, and Manila. It would become one of the most widely issued American weapons of the conflict. Yet it began as a logistical compromise, a weapon not designed to dominate the battlefield, but to ensure that soldiers who were never supposed to dominate it could survive on it. Normandy revealed the flaw in the original assumption. There's no such thing as a safe rear area in modern war. And when every soldier can become a frontline soldier without warning, the definition of who deserves a rifle changes. The M1 carbine was the Army's answer to a question it had not fully anticipated. What happens when the war reaches everyone? The answer would reshape how armies thought about arming their forces, not just rifle squads, but entire divisions. To understand how that happened, we must go back 4 years, back to 1940, back to a problem the U.S. Army did not yet recognize as transformative. The problem, the U.S. Army's hidden firepower gap, 1940. In 1940, the United States Army was not preparing for global war. It was modernizing cautiously, expanding slowly. observing events in Europe with professional interest, but without immediate urgency. The German blitzkrieg in Poland and France demonstrated the power of mechanized warfare. But inside the U.S. Army's planning offices, a quieter problem was emerging. It was not about tanks. It was not about aircraft. It was about who carried what weapon. On paper, an American infantry division appeared well armed. Rifle squads carried the M1 Garand. Automatic riflemen had the Browning automatic rifle. Machine gun sections provided sustained fire. Officers carried pistols. Support units had sidearms for personal defense. The structure was logical, but the Army was no longer composed only of riflemen and machine gunners. Modern divisions required vast numbers of specialists, radio operators, artillery crews, truck drivers, mortar teams, signal linemen, medical personnel, engineers, tank crews, military police. By 1940, planners recognized that in a mechanized army, the majority of soldiers would not be traditional infantry. They would still be targets. The official sidearm of many of these troops was the M1911 pistol. It was reliable, powerful at close range, and compact. But pistols are defensive weapons of last resort. They are difficult to aim accurately under stress. Effective range is limited. Magazine capacity is small. For soldiers whose primary duty was not combat, the pistol was considered sufficient. But European battlefields were already demonstrating a different reality. Rear areas were not secure. German airborne operations in the Netherlands. Rapid armored penetrations in France. Soviet deep battle doctrines. Partisan activity behind lines. Airborne drops. Mechanized thrusts. These developments blurred the line between front and rear. A driver delivering ammunition could encounter enemy patrols. An artillery observer could be cut off. A radio operator might have to defend his position for minutes or hours. In those moments, a pistol was inadequate. The obvious solution was to issue rifles. But rifles presented their own problem. The M1 Garand weighed approximately 9.5 pounds unloaded. It was long. It was powerful. It was built for sustained infantry combat. Issuing Garands to every support soldier would increase logistical burden, weight carried, and training requirements. More importantly, many support roles required mobility and technical specialization. Tank crews worked inside confined spaces. Signal personnel carried additional equipment. Engineers transported tools and explosives. A full-length battle rifle was impractical for many of these roles. The Army faced a gap. Pistols were too weak. Rifles were too heavy. Submachine guns existed. The Thompson was already in limited service, but it was expensive, heavy, and chambered in .45 ACP. Effective at short range, but lacking range and penetration beyond 50 to 100 yards. It was not suitable as a universal defensive arm. The problem was not about replacing the infantry rifle. It was about replacing the pistol. In June 1940, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department formalized the issue. They issued a requirement for a light rifle. The language was deliberate. Not a submachine gun. Not a shortened Garand. Not a pistol. A light rifle. The specifications reflected the gap. Weight, approximately 5 pounds. Effective range, 300 yards. Greater accuracy and range than a pistol. Easier to carry than a standard service rifle. Semi-automatic operation preferred. Detachable magazine. The Army was not trying to create a revolutionary infantry weapon. It was trying to solve an administrative vulnerability. But in doing so, it unknowingly began a transformation. Because once a lightweight semi-automatic weapon exists, lighter than a rifle, more controllable than a submachine gun, more capable than a pistol, the question inevitably arises, who should carry it? Initially, the answer was simple. Second-line troops, rear echelon personnel, specialists who might need to defend themselves but were not expected to initiate combat. The Army believed it was designing a niche solution. What it was actually doing was creating a weapon that would fit modern warfare better than it realized. Because modern warfare did not respect job descriptions. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, vast encirclements swallowed entire support columns. When Japanese forces advanced in the Pacific, jungle terrain erased clear front lines. When airborne troops landed behind enemy lines, they became isolated infantry regardless of their specialty. The American Army of 1940 could not yet see the scale of what was coming, but it recognized one fact. Too many soldiers were armed inadequately for the battlefield they might encounter. The pistol was no longer enough, and the rifle was not always practical. Between those two realities, a new category of weapon was about to emerge. It would be lighter than a rifle, more effective than a pistol, and far more influential than anyone expected. The solution would not come from redesigning the Garand. It would come from an unexpected source, one that initially declined to participate at all. The requirement: a light rifle for second-line troops. On June 15, 1940, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department issued a formal request. The document did not call for a new battle rifle. It did not call for a submachine gun. It did not call for a pistol redesign. It called for a light rifle. The terminology mattered. The Army understood exactly what it did not want. It did not want the weight and recoil of a full-power infantry rifle. It did not want the short effective range of a pistol cartridge. It did not want the cost and manufacturing complexity of the Thompson submachine gun. It wanted something between categories. The written requirement reflected that gap in precise terms. Weight not to exceed 5 pounds. Semi-automatic operation. Effective range of approximately 300 yards. Greater accuracy and range than a pistol. Detachable magazine. Compact dimensions suitable for vehicle crews and support personnel. This was not an infantry rifle replacement program. It was a defensive weapon program. The intended recipients were specific: artillery crews, mortar teams, signal corps personnel, drivers, tank crews, officers, military police. These soldiers were not expected to assault fortified positions. They were expected to defend themselves if attacked. The Army believed it was solving a narrow logistical issue, but the technical implications of the requirement were broader than planners realized. A 5-pound semi-automatic shoulder weapon with a 300-yard effective range did not exist in standard service anywhere in the world in 1940. Bolt-action carbines existed. Submachine guns existed. Pistols existed. But a lightweight, semi-automatic, intermediate-power shoulder weapon designed for mass issue to non-infantry troops was a new category. The ammunition question was central. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge used in the M1 Garand was powerful but heavy and produced significant recoil. It was unsuitable for a lightweight 5-pound platform. The .45 ACP pistol cartridge used in the Thompson lacked effective range beyond 100 yards. The Army needed something new. Winchester developed a cartridge specifically for the requirement, the .30 Carbine. It fired a 110-grain projectile at approximately 1,900 feet per second, more powerful than a pistol round, less powerful than a rifle cartridge, lightweight, manageable, capable of reaching 200 to 300 yards with acceptable accuracy. It was, in modern terminology, an intermediate cartridge, though not fully comparable to later assault rifle rounds. The competition that followed was unusual. The Ordnance Department invited multiple manufacturers to submit prototypes. Some companies responded enthusiastically. Others hesitated. The timeline was aggressive. Europe was already at war. France would fall within days of the requirement being issued. The United States had not yet entered the conflict, but rearmament was accelerating. The Army did not want a prolonged development cycle. It wanted something that could move from prototype to production quickly. Among the companies approached was Winchester. Winchester initially declined. Its engineers were occupied with existing military contracts. The company did not see a lightweight rifle as strategically significant. That assessment would change. Other submissions failed to meet reliability standards. Some were too heavy. Others were mechanically complex. A few resembled scaled-down rifles rather than purpose-built weapons. The ordnance trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground revealed a consistent problem. Designing a weapon that light without sacrificing durability was difficult. Weight reduction often meant mechanical fragility. Reliability was non-negotiable. By late 1940, it became clear that the Army's requirement was more challenging than originally anticipated. The weapon needed to be light, simple, reliable, inexpensive, rapidly manufacturable. These constraints narrowed the field. Winchester reconsidered. Its engineering team, led by Edwin Pugsley and assisted by David Carbine Williams, began work under intense time pressure. The result would be submitted in August 1941. It would weigh just over 5 pounds. It would function reliably in trials. It would meet the Army's demand for simplicity and ease of manufacture. And it would win. On October 22, 1941, the U.S. Army formally adopted the weapon as a U.S. Carbine caliber .30 M1. At the moment of adoption, it was still categorized as a niche weapon. Its intended purpose remained unchanged: arm those who were not expected to fight as infantry. No one predicted that within 3 years, this light rifle would be present in nearly every theater of war. No one anticipated that it would be issued to airborne troops in large numbers. No one foresaw that it would become one of the most widely produced American weapons of the Second World War. The requirement had been administrative. The outcome would be industrial and operational. The Army believed it had solved a support troop vulnerability. It had, in fact, created a weapon uniquely suited to the fluid, decentralized combat that modern war would demand. But first it had to prove itself. And the first test would not be on a battlefield. It would be on a production line. The requirement: a light rifle for second-line troops. On June 15, 1940, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department issued a formal request. The document did not call for a new battle rifle. It did not call for a submachine gun. It did not call for a pistol redesign. It called for a light rifle. The terminology mattered. The Army understood exactly what it did not want. It did not want the weight and recoil of a full-power infantry rifle. It did not want the short effective range of a pistol cartridge. It did not want the cost and manufacturing complexity of the Thompson submachine gun. It wanted something between categories. The written requirement reflected that gap in precise terms: weight not to exceed 5 pounds, semi-automatic operation, effective range of approximately 300 yards, greater accuracy and range than a pistol, detachable magazine, compact dimensions suitable for vehicle crews and support personnel. This was not an infantry rifle replacement program. It was a defensive weapon program. The intended recipients were specific: artillery crews, mortar teams, signal corps personnel, drivers, tank crews, officers, military police. These soldiers were not expected to assault fortified positions. They were expected to defend themselves if attacked. The Army believed it was solving a narrow logistical issue, but the technical implications of the requirement were broader than planners realized. A 5-pound semi-automatic shoulder weapon with a 300-yard effective range did not exist in standard service anywhere in the world in 1940. Bolt-action carbines existed. Submachine guns existed. Pistols existed. But a lightweight, semi-automatic, intermediate-power shoulder weapon designed for mass issue to non-infantry troops was a new category. The ammunition question was central. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge used in the M1 Garand was powerful but heavy and produced significant recoil. It was unsuitable for a lightweight 5-pound platform. The .45 ACP pistol cartridge used in the Thompson lacked effective range beyond 100 yards. The Army needed something new. Winchester developed a cartridge specifically for the requirement: the .30 Carbine. It fired a 110-grain projectile at approximately 1,900 feet per second, more powerful than a pistol round, less powerful than a rifle cartridge, lightweight, manageable, capable of reaching 200 to 300 yards with acceptable accuracy. It was, in modern terminology, an intermediate cartridge, though not fully comparable to later assault rifle rounds. The competition that followed was unusual. The Ordnance Department invited multiple manufacturers to submit prototypes. Some companies responded enthusiastically. Others hesitated. The timeline was aggressive. Europe was already at war. France would fall within days of the requirement being issued. The United States had not yet entered the conflict, but rearmament was accelerating. The Army did not want a prolonged development cycle. It wanted something that could move from prototype to production quickly. Among the companies approached was Winchester. Winchester initially declined. Its engineers were occupied with existing military contracts. The company did not see a lightweight rifle as strategically significant. That assessment would change. Other submissions failed to meet reliability standards. Some were too heavy. Others were mechanically complex. A few resembled scaled-down rifles rather than purpose-built weapons. The ordnance trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground revealed a consistent problem. Designing a weapon that light without sacrificing durability was difficult. Weight reduction often meant mechanical fragility. Reliability was non-negotiable. By late 1940, it became clear that the Army's requirement was more challenging than originally anticipated. The weapon needed to be light, simple, reliable, inexpensive, rapidly manufacturable. These constraints narrowed the field. Winchester reconsidered. Its engineering team, led by Edwin Pugsley and assisted by David Carbine Williams, began work under intense time pressure. The result would be submitted in August 1941. It would weigh just over 5 pounds. It would function reliably in trials. It would meet the Army's demand for simplicity and ease of manufacture. And it would win. On October 22, 1941, the U.S. Army formally adopted the weapon as a U.S. Carbine caliber .30 M1. At the moment of adoption, it was still categorized as a niche weapon. Its intended purpose remained unchanged. Arm those who were not expected to fight as infantry. No one predicted that within 3 years, this light rifle would be present in nearly every theater of war. No one anticipated that it would be issued to airborne troops in large numbers. No one foresaw that it would become one of the most widely produced American weapons of the Second World War. The requirement had been administrative. The outcome would be industrial and operational. The Army believed it had solved the support troop vulnerability. It had, in fact, created a weapon uniquely suited to the fluid, decentralized combat that modern war would demand. But first it had to prove itself. And the first test would not be on a battlefield. It would be on a production line. Industrial miracle. 10 companies, 6 million rifles. The M1 Carbine was not just a weapon. It was a production strategy. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the scale of mobilization required was unprecedented. Millions of men would be inducted. Entire divisions would be formed from scratch. Equipment shortages were immediate and severe. The M1 Garand was already in production, but it was complex. It required skilled machining, precise tolerances, and established arms factories. Springfield Armory in Winchester could not simply multiply output overnight. The carbine was different. It was lighter. It used fewer raw materials. It required less machining time. It could be built in decentralized facilities. The Ordnance Department made a deliberate decision. Production would not be centralized in traditional arms manufacturers. It would be distributed across American industry. 10 prime contractors were eventually assigned to produce the M1 Carbine. Winchester, Inland Division of General Motors, Underwood Typewriter Company, IBM, National Postal Meter, Rockola Manufacturing Corporation, Quality Hardware and Machine, Standard Products, Saginaw Steering Gear, General Motors, Irwin Peterson, later absorbed into Saginaw Production. Many of these companies had never produced firearms. Underwood made typewriters. IBM produced office equipment. Rockola built jukeboxes. National Postal Meter manufactured postage meters. General Motors divisions produced automotive components. Yet by 1943, these companies were manufacturing semi-automatic rifles. The carbine's design made this possible. It was modular. Its components could be subcontracted across hundreds of smaller firms. Parts were standardized for interchangeability. A bolt manufactured by one company could function in a receiver produced by another. This was not accidental engineering. It was industrial foresight. Production accelerated rapidly. In 1942 alone, more than 600,000 carbines were produced. By 1943, output exceeded 2 million units annually. At peak production, factories were producing over 40,000 carbines per month across the network. By the end of the war, total production reached approximately 6.1 million rifles. That figure exceeded total M1 Garand production during the same period. Combined German G43 and STG-44 production, most other Allied infantry small arms. The carbine became the most produced American small arm of World War II. The scale changed its role. Originally intended for support troops, the carbine was now available in enormous numbers. Distribution expanded. Paratroopers requested it for its compact size. Officers preferred it over pistols. Machine gun crews valued it for defensive firepower. Tankers carried it because it fit inside cramped hulls. Signal units issued it widely. Military police adopted it. Even some frontline infantry units began using carbines in place of heavier rifles for certain roles. The production network itself became a strategic advantage. If one factory experienced delays, others continued. If a subcontractor failed, components could be sourced elsewhere. This decentralized manufacturing model was resilient against disruption. It also reflected something larger. The American war effort was not only about producing powerful weapons, it was about producing them in overwhelming quantity. Germany would later produce approximately 425,000 STG-44 assault rifles. The United States produced over 6 million carbines. Even if the carbine was not a perfect infantry weapon, its availability ensured that vast numbers of soldiers were armed with something far more effective than a pistol, and quantity has its own strategic effect. By 1944, an American division contained thousands of carbines. They were present in headquarters units, artillery batteries, engineer battalions, armored formations, and airborne regiments. This meant something important. Firepower was no longer concentrated only in rifle squads. It was distributed across the division. Support troops who might once have carried pistols now carried semi-automatic shoulder weapons with 15-round magazines. In chaotic engagements, this mattered. A convoy ambushed by German infantry did not rely solely on a handful of riflemen. Drivers and mechanics could return fire with effective weapons. A forward observation post cut off from reinforcements could defend itself. An artillery battery under surprise attack could produce sustained defensive fire. The carbine multiplied defensive capability across the entire structure of the Army. It did not replace the Garand. It expanded the baseline of who was armed effectively, and because it was lighter and easier to carry, it did not interfere with specialized roles. Production numbers alone do not determine battlefield success, but production numbers determine who is armed. And by 1944, millions of American soldiers who would otherwise have carried pistols were carrying carbines instead. That shift would soon be tested under combat conditions, because a weapon designed for defensive support would soon be carried into some of the most intense fighting of the war, and its performance that would define its reputation. Ballistics reality, what the .30 carbine actually was. The reputation of the M1 Carbine has always centered on one question: was it powerful enough? To answer that, the cartridge must be understood on its own terms. The .30 carbine round fired a 110-grain full metal jacket projectile at approximately 1,900 feet per second from the standard 18-inch barrel. That placed it in a category between pistol and rifle cartridges. For comparison, .45 ACP, Thompson/M1911, 850 feet per second. 9mm Parabellum, 150 feet per second. .30 carbine, 900 feet per second. .30-06 Springfield, M1 Garand, 700, 800 feet per second. The carbine cartridge delivered significantly more velocity and flatter trajectory than pistol ammunition. It did not approach the energy of a full-power rifle round. That was intentional. The Army's requirement was not to duplicate rifle performance. It was to exceed pistol performance while remaining controllable in a lightweight platform. At 100 yards, the .30 carbine round retained sufficient velocity to penetrate standard steel helmets and light cover. At 200 yards, it remained accurate and lethal against exposed personnel. Its effective combat range was generally considered to be between 200 and 300 yards. Beyond that, velocity dropped significantly compared to rifle cartridges. But modern infantry combat statistics, even during World War II, showed that most small arms engagements occurred under 300 yards. In Europe, hedgerows, forests, villages, and rolling terrain limited sightlines. In the Pacific, jungle vegetation restricted engagement distances even further. The carbine was built for that environment. Its recoil was mild. Its muzzle climb was manageable. Rapid follow-up shots were easy. For minimally trained troops, this mattered more than raw power. The weapon itself weighed approximately 5.2 pounds unloaded. Loaded with a 15-round magazine, it remained significantly lighter than the Garand. This weight reduction changed how it was carried. Tank crews could sling it inside cramped interiors. Paratroopers could jump with it more easily than with a full-length rifle. Radio operators could carry it without sacrificing mobility. The carbine's attachable 15-round magazine also represented a tactical difference from the Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip. Reloading was faster and more flexible. Partial magazines could be swapped. Ammunition could be carried in greater quantity due to the lighter cartridge weight. An individual soldier could carry more rounds of .30 carbine than .30-06 for the same weight. This increased sustained defensive capability for support units. However, ballistic performance has trade-offs. The .30 carbine lacked the penetration of the .30-06 against thick cover, heavy timber, or sandbags. It was less effective at long range. It was not ideal for engaging targets beyond 300 yards. It was not designed for that role. The criticism that it was underpowered often stemmed from comparing it to full infantry rifles rather than to the pistol it was meant to replace. Against a pistol, the carbine was dramatically superior in accuracy, range, and magazine capacity. Against a submachine gun firing .45 ACP, the carbine offered flatter trajectory and greater effective range. Against a battle rifle, it was clearly less powerful. The carbine occupied a middle ground. In modern terms, it was closer in concept to a personal defense weapon or an early intermediate platform than to a traditional rifle. What made it strategically important was not its ballistic dominance. It was its balance. Light enough to issue widely, powerful enough to matter, simple enough to mass produce, controllable enough for minimally trained personnel. This balance allowed it to function across multiple roles. Airborne units appreciated its compactness. Military police valued its deterrent presence. Engineers relied on its manageable recoil. Tank crews depended on its defensive capacity after dismounting. And because millions were produced, it became common in frontline environments, even if that was not its original purpose. The ballistic reality of the .30 carbine was not about matching the Garand. It was about redefining the baseline. Instead of thousands of soldiers armed only with pistols, divisions now contained thousands armed with lightweight semi-automatic carbines. The shift was subtle, but it altered the density of firepower across the Army. The carbine was not meant to dominate firefights. It was meant to prevent vulnerability. And when war dissolved clear lines between combat and support, that prevention became crucial. The next test would not be theoretical. It would be operational. Because once issued in large numbers, the carbine did not remain in rear areas. It moved forward. And in doing so, it began to change who counted as armed on the battlefield. Frontline transformation. When support troops became firepower, the M1 Carbine was designed for soldiers who were not supposed to initiate combat. War did not respect that assumption. By 1943, American forces were engaged in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. Divisions were moving across fluid front lines. Mechanized warfare, airborne operations, and jungle fighting created constant instability. In these environments, rear areas were temporary. Convoys were ambushed. Command posts were overrun. Artillery batteries were targeted. Airborne units landed scattered across enemy territory. Support troops found themselves in firefights. Before the carbine, these encounters often exposed a weakness. A radio operator armed with a pistol could not deliver sustained suppressive fire. A truck driver with only a sidearm was at a severe disadvantage if attacked by infantry with rifles. An artillery crew might possess technical skill and discipline, but lacked effective individual weapons. The carbine changed that equation. It did not transform support soldiers into rifle squads. It did not replace infantry doctrine. It increased baseline survivability. Consider airborne operations. Paratroopers valued compact weapons. Jumping with a full-length Garand was cumbersome. Weapons were often dropped separately in equipment canisters. In the confusion after landing, a lighter weapon that could be carried attached to the body had clear advantages. Many airborne troops carried carbines for this reason. In Normandy, scattered paratroopers regrouped using whatever weapons they had immediately available. Carbines were common among them. In hedgerow fighting, their compact size made them maneuverable in confined terrain. In Italy, mountainous terrain and village combat further reduced engagement distances. Support units operating in forward areas found themselves under sudden attack. The carbine allowed them to respond with effective fire beyond pistol range. Tank crews experienced a similar shift. Inside a Sherman tank, a full-length rifle was awkward. Crew members relied primarily on vehicle-mounted weapons. But when tanks were disabled or abandoned, crews became infantry temporarily. A pistol offered limited defensive capability. A carbine offered reach. Artillery units, often positioned within range of enemy counterattacks, relied on perimeter defense. Carbines issued to gun crews increased defensive density around batteries. Military police, tasked with controlling movement and maintaining order near front lines, benefited from a visible and effective shoulder weapon that was not excessively heavy. The impact was cumulative. American divisions contained thousands of carbines distributed across non-infantry units. In a chaotic engagement, that meant more soldiers capable of delivering sustained fire. This did not make the carbine a substitute for the Garand. Infantry rifle squads still relied on Garands and Browning automatic rifles for primary offensive operations. But in situations where units became isolated, cut off, or unexpectedly engaged, the carbine often became the weapon that allowed survival. German reports occasionally noted heavier than expected resistance from support units, not because these units were trained as assault infantry, but because they were no longer limited to pistols. The carbine did not produce dramatic battlefield revolutions. It produced small, distributed increases in defensive capability, and distributed capability accumulates. When thousands of support soldiers carry semi-automatic carbines instead of sidearms, the structure of a division changes subtly. The line between combatant and support narrows. Firepower becomes more evenly spread. In fluid warfare, this matters. The carbine's role expanded further in the Pacific. Jungle terrain reduced engagement distances. Visibility was limited. Encounters were sudden. In these conditions, compactness and rapid fire were valuable. Some infantry units even requested additional carbines for patrol work in dense terrain. Though originally conceived as a defensive weapon, it proved adaptable. It was not superior to the Garand in range or penetration. It was often more practical in confined environments. By 1944, the M1 Carbine was no longer confined to rear areas. It was present in assault waves, airborne drops, armored columns, artillery positions, and supply convoys. It did not replace the rifle squad's core weapons. It supplemented the entire division. The transformation was not doctrinally dramatic. No official manual declared the carbine a revolutionary infantry tool. Yet in practice, it altered the density of armed personnel across the Army. The soldier who once carried only a pistol now carried a semi-automatic shoulder weapon with 15 rounds. In modern warfare, where surprise and mobility define combat, that difference could determine survival. The carbine had moved beyond its original purpose. The next question would be whether it could withstand the most difficult battlefield environment of all. The Pacific jungle would test not just its handling, but its power, and it was there that its reputation would be debated most intensely. The Pacific tests jungle combat and close-range war. If Europe tested the carbine's flexibility, the Pacific tested its limits. The jungle did not resemble European battlefields. There were no long hedgerow sightlines. No rolling farmland. No extended visibility across open terrain. Engagements were sudden. Distances were short. Visibility was often measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Humidity, mud, and vegetation created harsh operating conditions for weapons. In this environment, the carbine's compactness became an advantage. Its short overall length allowed maneuvering through thick brush. Its light weight reduced fatigue during long patrols in oppressive heat. Its mild recoil allowed rapid follow-up shots during ambush encounters. Jungle warfare favored mobility. Patrols were frequent. Encounters occurred at close range. Under these conditions, the carbine's 15-round detachable magazine and semi-automatic action were practical. However, the Pacific also produced the carbine's most persistent criticism. Reports emerged, particularly from late-war fighting in the Philippines and Okinawa, that the carbine lacked stopping power. Some soldiers claimed that Japanese troops, even when hit, did not immediately fall. These reports must be examined carefully. First, context matters. Japanese infantry tactics often emphasize aggressive close-range assaults, including night attacks and banzai charges. In such situations, soldiers might continue advancing despite wounds, whether struck by carbine rounds or full-power rifle fire. Second, ammunition design played a role. The standard .30 carbine round was a 110-grain full metal jacket projectile. Like most military ammunition of the period, it was designed for reliability and compliance with international conventions. It was not optimized for expansion or immediate incapacitation. Third, environmental factors influence perception. Jungle combat often involved targets partially obscured by vegetation. Bullets striking branches or leaves could deflect. Engagement distances were unpredictable. Rapid movement and adrenaline affected observation. Comparisons with the .30-06 Garand round were inevitable. The Garand delivered greater energy and penetration. Against heavy cover or fortified positions, it was superior, but most close-range jungle engagements did not involve shooting through thick timber or at extended range. The carbine was not underpowered relative to the pistol it replaced. It was less powerful than a battle rifle. That distinction shaped perception. Some infantry units in the Pacific preferred the Garand for frontline assault roles. Others valued the carbine for patrol work, especially in dense terrain. The introduction of the M2 Carbine late in the war added selective fire capability, allowing automatic fire at close range. Though not widely issued before war's end, it demonstrated how the platform could evolve toward greater firepower in confined environments. It is also important to consider logistics. The lighter .30 carbine cartridge allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. In extended jungle patrols where resupply was uncertain, this mattered. A soldier could carry significantly more carbine rounds than .30-06 for the same weight. More ammunition meant greater sustained engagement capability. Japanese forces occasionally captured carbines and used them when ammunition was available. Reports indicate that enemy troops recognized the weapon's utility at close range. The Pacific Theater amplified both the strengths and weaknesses of the carbine. Strengths: lightweight, compact size, manageable recoil, adequate effectiveness at short range, increased ammunition carry capacity. Limitations: reduced penetration compared to full rifle cartridges, limited effectiveness beyond 300 yards, perceived lack of immediate incapacitation in some close combat scenarios. The reputation of the carbine in the Pacific became polarized. Some veterans praised its handling and practicality. Others criticized its power relative to Garand. Both assessments contained truth, depending on context. The carbine was never designed to replace the Garand in sustained infantry assault. It was designed to replace the pistol. When judged against that original requirement, it exceeded expectations. When judged against a battle rifle, it inevitably fell short. The Pacific Theater demonstrated a broader lesson. Weapons must be evaluated within the role they are designed to fill. The carbine filled a gap. It did not eliminate the need for rifles. It expanded the baseline of who was armed effectively. But criticism and myth would follow it long after the war. Claims of inadequate stopping power would persist. Stories would circulate. And as with many wartime weapons, Reputation would often overshadow documented performance. To understand the carbine fully, those myths must be examined directly, because perception shapes legacy as much as statistics. Myths and complaints. It had no stopping power. No World War II small arm escape criticism. The M1 Carbine, despite its production numbers and widespread issue, developed one of the most persistent reputations of the war. It had no stopping power. The phrase appears repeatedly in post-war memoirs, interviews, and informal accounts, particularly from veterans who fought in the Pacific. To understand this criticism, it must be separated from context and examined against evidence. The .30 carbine cartridge generated roughly 900 to 1,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The .30-06 Springfield generated more than 2,700 foot-pounds. The difference is substantial. But stopping power is not a formal ballistic term. It is a subjective description, influenced by expectation, adrenaline, and combat conditions. Most complaints about stopping power came from comparisons with the Garand, not with the pistol the carbine replaced. A soldier accustomed to the dramatic effect of a full-power rifle might perceive the carbine's impact as less decisive. In jungle fighting, where Japanese troops sometimes advanced aggressively even after being hit, the perception of insufficient stopping effect intensified. But similar accounts exist regarding rifle fire as well. Combat physiology is unpredictable. Wounded individuals may continue moving briefly due to adrenaline, momentum, or psychological factors. Ballistic data from the period does not indicate that the .30 carbine was ineffective within its intended range. At distances under 200 yards, it could penetrate helmets, light cover, and standard field gear. U.S. Army testing before adoption confirmed lethality well beyond pistol range. What the carbine did not provide was long-range penetration or the heavy impact associated with high-velocity rifle rounds. And that difference became exaggerated over time. Another factor influenced perception. Late war combat against Japanese forces often involved close-quarters fighting, night attacks, and fortified positions. In such scenarios, soldiers sometimes preferred the Garand for its greater penetration and psychological reassurance. Reassurance matters in combat. Confidence in one's weapon can affect morale. The carbine's lighter recoil and smaller cartridge may have created the impression, accurate or not, that it was less decisive. There were also technical variables. Early production magazines occasionally experienced feeding issues. Maintenance in tropical conditions was challenging. Ammunition quality and storage conditions varied. These practical concerns sometimes merge with ballistic criticism. However, when analyzed statistically, the carbine performed within the role it was designed to fill. It was not intended to defeat fortified bunkers. It was not intended for 500-yard engagements. It was intended to arm soldiers who would otherwise carry pistols. In that comparison, the carbine was overwhelmingly superior. It offered greater range, greater magazine capacity, greater accuracy, greater penetration, greater sustained fire capability. The no-stopping power narrative persists largely because it is simple and memorable. It also emerged during the Korean War, where extreme cold affected ammunition performance and weapon reliability. That later experience often became retroactively attached to World War II evaluations. Primary World War II documentation does not show widespread formal rejection of the carbine. Instead, it shows mixed field reports depending on environment and mission. Some infantry preferred the Garand. Some airborne units valued the carbine's mobility. Support troops overwhelmingly benefited from its issuance. The myth persists because it fits a narrative. Lighter weapon equals weaker weapon. But battlefield effectiveness is not measured only by energy figures. It is measured by whether soldiers who would otherwise be underarmed are now capable of defending themselves. On that metric, the carbine succeeded. The criticism reveals something else. When a weapon becomes widely issued, 6 million units, it will inevitably be used outside its original design envelope. And when it is judged outside that envelope, dissatisfaction can follow. The carbine was not a battle rifle. It was not a submachine gun. It was not a pistol. It existed between categories. And weapons that occupy middle ground are often misunderstood. To understand how the enemy viewed it requires another perspective, because German and Japanese forces encountered the carbine under very different circumstances, and their assessments were often more pragmatic than emotional. German and Japanese impressions captured carbines in enemy hands. The true measure of a weapon is not only how its users describe it, it is how the enemy reacts to it. Throughout World War II, German and Japanese forces captured American equipment in significant quantities. Rifles, machine guns, radios, vehicles, and ammunition were examined, reused, or redistributed when possible. The M1 Carbine was among the most frequently captured American small arms. Its compact size made it attractive. Its detachable magazine simplified operation. Its semi-automatic fire provided immediate tactical value. If ammunition was available, German experience in Europe. In the European theater, German forces encountered carbines in multiple contexts: airborne operations, armored engagements, rear area security missions, captured supply depots. Unlike the M1 Garand, which required N-block clips and .30-06 ammunition, the carbine required .30 carbine ammunition, cartridges not stocked in German supply chains. This limited widespread adoption. However, German soldiers occasionally used captured carbines temporarily, especially when ammunition was captured alongside the weapon. Interrogation reports and battlefield intelligence summaries indicate that German troops recognized the carbine as lightweight, easy to handle, effective at short to medium range. German doctrine still centered around the machine gun as the core of infantry firepower. The carbine did not fundamentally threaten that structure. But in close engagements, especially against support units unexpectedly armed with carbines, German soldiers sometimes encountered heavier resistance than anticipated. The carbine's significance in Europe was less about raw power and more about distribution. It armed personnel who previously would not have been major contributors to firefights. German after-action observations occasionally noted that American artillery units and rear echelon formations offered stronger small arms resistance than similar units in other armies. The carbine was part of that reason. It did not transform American doctrine. It altered the density of armed defenders. Japanese encounters in the Pacific. In the Pacific, the carbine appeared in jungle fighting, island assaults, and defensive perimeter engagements. Japanese forces captured carbines on occasion, though ammunition shortages limited sustained use. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive assault and close engagement. In that context, the carbine's light recoil and quick handling were advantageous. Some captured weapons were used opportunistically. Japanese technical evaluations of American weapons, conducted when possible, often focused on reliability and manufacturing quality. The carbine's construction reflected American industrial methods: interchangeable parts, stamped components, simplified machining. It was not elegant in the European tradition. It was practical. Japanese forces were more likely to capture and reuse American submachine guns or rifles if ammunition was accessible. The carbine's logistical incompatibility prevented widespread enemy adoption, but its presence in American units affected tactical expectations. Japanese attacks on support units sometimes met greater resistance than anticipated. Instead of facing pistol-armed personnel, attackers encountered semi-automatic shoulder weapons capable of rapid fire at moderate distance. This did not deter determined assaults. It increased the cost. Perception from the opposing side. Neither German nor Japanese forces appear to have regarded the carbine as revolutionary in the way they later recognized the M1 Garand's distributed rifle fire or the STG-44's automatic capability. The carbine was not seen as a primary assault weapon. It was seen as a competent, practical, lightweight firearm. Its strategic impact lay not in overwhelming power, but in ubiquity. It was everywhere, in convoy ambushes, in rear area defense, in airborne drops, in armored columns. Enemy soldiers did not face isolated pistol fire from support units. They faced semi-automatic carbines. This difference was incremental, not dramatic. But incremental advantages across thousands of engagements accumulate. Captured weapons often reflect what soldiers respect. The carbine's occasional battlefield reuse by enemy troops suggests recognition of its practicality. It was not feared in the way machine guns or artillery were feared. It was not mythologized. It was useful. And in war, usefulness matters more than mythology. The carbine had now proven itself across theaters. It had armed millions. It had endured criticism. It had expanded beyond its original purpose. What remained was its broader doctrinal consequence. Because once a weapon is issued in such vast numbers, it does more than fill a gap. It changes expectations. It changes who is considered armed. And in doing so, it shifts how divisions fight, even if official doctrine remains unchanged. Doctrines shift. Distributed firepower beyond the rifle squad. The M1 Carbine did not rewrite U.S. infantry doctrine. No field manual declared it revolutionary. No doctrinal reform reorganized squads around it. It did not replace the M1 Garand as the standard rifle. And yet, it quietly altered something fundamental. Before the Second World War, most armies concentrated meaningful small arms firepower inside rifle squads and machine gun teams. Support units were armed lightly. Rear echelon personnel carried pistols. Officers carried sidearms. Artillery crews depended on perimeter security from infantry units. Firepower was concentrated. The carbine dispersed it. By 1944, an American infantry division contained thousands of M1 carbines distributed across headquarters companies, signal battalions, engineer units, medical detachments, artillery batteries, armored crews, military police, logistics and transport units. These soldiers were not riflemen, but they were no longer lightly armed. The shift was structural. In earlier wars, if rear units were surprised, their defensive response relied on pistols, a limited number of rifles, machine gun sections positioned for static defense. In World War II, American divisions contained a distributed layer of semi-automatic carbines throughout their organization. This created what could be described as baseline firepower. Even when rifle companies were absent, American formations were not defenseless. When German units probed rear areas during the Battle of the Bulge, support elements responded with organized resistance. When Japanese forces launched infiltration attacks in the Pacific, they encountered armed artillery crews and engineers capable of sustained semi-automatic fire. The carbine did not make these units infantry. It reduced their vulnerability. The difference is subtle but important. In the Garand's case, the transformation occurred within the rifle squad, distributing semi-automatic fire among frontline infantry. With the carbine, the transformation occurred across the division, arming non-infantry personnel more effectively. Together, these changes increased overall American small arms density. Germany faced a different structure. German infantry squads were built around the machine gun. Support units were less uniformly armed with semi-automatic shoulder weapons. Even when Germany developed advanced weapons like the G-43 or STG-44, production limitations prevented universal distribution. The United States achieved something different. It combined high rifle production Garands with massive carbine production. The result was layered firepower. Infantry squads dominated engagements with Garands and bars. Support units defended themselves with carbines. Airborne units blended both. The Army did not consciously design this as a doctrinal revolution. It emerged from industrial capacity and logistical planning, and it reflected an evolving understanding of modern war. There are no permanent rear areas. Mechanized warfare, airborne operations, and deep penetration tactics collapsed traditional front lines. When every soldier may encounter combat, arming only designated riflemen becomes insufficient. The carbine represented institutional recognition of this reality. It was not an assault rifle. It was not a battle rifle. It was a bridge. And that bridge foreshadowed future developments. After the war, militaries worldwide moved toward lighter, more universally issued small arms. The Soviet AK-47 would arm not only infantry, but entire formations. NATO countries adopted selective fire rifles for broader distribution. The distinction between frontline riflemen and support soldier narrowed. The carbine did not directly create this shift, but it demonstrated its practicality. By the end of World War II, American divisions were structured differently than in 1940. Not because manuals changed, because equipment changed. When millions of soldiers carry lightweight semi-automatic carbines, the concept of rear area vulnerability weakens. Firepower becomes normalized, distributed, expected, and once that expectation exists, future armies adapt to it. The carbine began as a logistical compromise. It ended as a structural adjustment. Its final legacy would not be measured in muzzle energy or penetration charts. It would be measured in how it changed who counted as armed. Conclusion: the weapon that changed who was armed. The M1 Carbine did not win the war. It did not dominate headlines. It did not redefine infantry assault doctrine. It did not replace the M1 Garand as the symbol of American rifle power. It was never meant to. It began as a practical solution to a narrow problem. Too many soldiers carried pistols. Too many roles required something more. Too many support personnel were exposed in a modern battlefield that no longer respected rear areas. The Army asked for a light rifle. It received something more consequential. By the end of World War II, over 6 million carbines had been produced. They armed radio operators, artillery crews, engineers, tankers, military police, officers, paratroopers, logistics units. They were present in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, the Philippines, Okinawa, and countless smaller engagements. They were carried in trucks, inside tanks, slung over shoulders during airborne drops, and stacked in artillery positions. They were used in defense more often than in assault. They were issued broadly, not selectively, and that was their strategic importance. The carbine changed the baseline expectation of who deserved a shoulder-fired semi-automatic weapon. Before the war, armies accepted that large portions of their manpower would carry pistols. After the war, that assumption weakened. The distinction between combat troop and support troop narrowed. The carbine's success lay in its balance. Light enough to carry without burden. Powerful enough to matter beyond pistol range. Simple enough to mass produce. Common enough to reshape distribution. It was not perfect. It faced criticism over stopping power. It lacked the long-range authority of the Garand. It was sometimes used beyond its intended role and judged accordingly. But measured against its original requirement, it exceeded expectations. More importantly, it demonstrated a principle. When war becomes fluid and decentralized, arming only designated riflemen is insufficient. Distributed firepower is resilience. The carbine was not an assault rifle. It was not the future of infantry weapons in technical terms. But conceptually, it pointed toward a future in which more soldiers, not fewer, would carry capable, lightweight, semi-automatic firearms. After 1945, armies worldwide moved toward broader issuance of shoulder weapons with higher capacity and lighter weight. The carbine did not create that trend alone. It validated it. In museums today, the M1 Carbine appears smaller than expected. Its proportions seem modest beside the Garand. Its cartridge appears unremarkable beside full-power rifle rounds. Its legacy is not dramatic. It is structural. It represents a moment when the United States decided that rear echelon vulnerability was unacceptable. It represents industrial flexibility, jukebox factories and typewriter companies building rifles by the millions. It represents the understanding that in modern war, every soldier may become a frontline soldier without warning. The carbine did not change how squads attacked. It changed who was prepared to defend. And sometimes in war, that distinction determined survival.